Mission Specialist Clark, log number 1095.75, Earth year 2531. It's been almost 48 hours since I got out of cryosleep. The adaptation time has been a bit longer than expected, and I feel like I've just gotten my bearings. The nausea is barely present, but my mind remains a bit foggy. The rest are still out cold. There's a small margin of time before the main pilot and the captain are absolutely necessary for the next step in our mission. However, the fact that they still haven't woken up from cryosleep worries me terribly. The two of them were the first of the Horizon crew that was supposed to be out of the chambers before the rest of us. We have remained on a steady course to the extraplanetary object and getting even closer to the Oort cloud. The object is massive enough to be able to be seen already, but it's so dark that it's impossible to spot from any porthole yet. So I'm fully relying on our sensors to guide me. There have been a few deep scans of the cloud that the onboard AI has been performing in regular intervals. Nothing for now, I would say, is out of the ordinary or much different from what was hypothesized. The extraplanetary object is another thing altogether. As of yet, the scanners haven't been able to penetrate through the thick hull that seems to be made from an alloy that is foreign to anything we have in our database. The only thing we know for certain is its location, which is strange in itself. Before leaving Earth, we had presumed that it was in orbit around some kind of astronomical body that, well, it wasn't registering on our scans. Nonetheless, there is no sign of anything, even now. The extraplanetary vessel had somehow managed to come to a dead stop and remain inert at the very edge of the heliosphere for the past 1,000 years. To think that we've only discovered it 100 years ago, and when it had arrived at its present location, Galileo was still not born. Mission Specialist Clark, log number 1095.75, addendum. It's been a few hours now, and I have to note that the odd sound I've been hearing since I awoke has become more frequent and intense. I haven't run additional scans yet, but the internal and external readings of the horizon show the status of the areas of the vessel as nominal. I wonder if I'm just exaggerating a phenomenon that might actually be normal. However, this is the first mission of its kind. I felt it deserved a log entry. My worries about the status of the crew in cryosleep remain. Our approach to the object is constant. Sensors are registering it as dormant. Mission Specialist Clark, log number 1096.45. Horizon nominal. Crew in cryosleep. Oh, it already feels like I've been alone on this ship for 1,000 years, even though the AI keeps telling me that it has only been a few days since I exited my cryo chamber. I don't think this AI can really feel the passage of time, or it would have agreed with me. It also seems unfazed by that awful sound that appears in regular intervals. Is it being picked up by my mic? If I didn't know any better, I would describe it as heavy rain or thunder. Strange how the mind interprets things. And anyway, I'm preparing new parameters for a special scan of the hull, factoring in the possibility that the extraplanetary vessel might somehow be affecting the horizon. I shall wait for the additional scans of the Oort cloud to be done before I run it. The readings of the cloud have turned quite fascinating, the closer we get to it. The more information the scans acquire on what is out there paints a much clearer picture of the universe that surrounds our tiny little planet. However, my understanding might be completely wrong, since it's not my area of expertise to read such scans. My excitement for being the first human to lay eyes on the sphere that surrounds our solar system is the only thing keeping me from losing my mind to that illogical sound. I can't wait for our mission astronomer to emerge from cryosleep and see the readings. I'm sure he'll be amazed to find out that some of his theories were incorrect. Who knows what else is out there? Oh, and on that note, who knows how many more ships patrol our galaxy beyond the cloud?
Going through my logs from the first few days that I was alone on the horizon is a deeply surreal experience. I don't even remember who I was back then. She, or rather past me, still didn't know and couldn't even fathom what awaits her. Needless to state the obvious, those sounds she was hearing were no normal phenomenon. And that ship, oh, that ship. What a dreadful surprise it would turn out to be. As the next hours on the horizon went by, past me was getting more and more nervous, since there was no notification of anyone being prepared by the cryo systems to be awakened. I had inspected the chambers as best I could with my limited knowledge of cryotech, and there seemed to be nothing wrong with them. The AI assured me that all 12 of my colleagues and crewmates were perfectly fine and dandy, happily immersed in cryo dreams. However, this was the moment that I first considered finding a way to open the chambers manually if it would come to that. To my continuous frustration, I was unable to find a way around the security protocols, and my AI friend wasn't willing to do me any favors. What it didn't seem to understand was that getting closer to the extraplanetary ship meant that our pilot should be awake, ready, and adjusting our course, so that we don't crash into it before we could even meet our potential cosmic neighbors. Not that there was a chance they were still alive, I thought naively in that moment. Since the going assumption of mission control was that everything was possible, the captain should have already been preparing for first contact days ago. Even with me as a mission specialist on possible intercultural communication, it was she that was delegated the honor and pleasure to be Earth's ambassador in all things alien. Days passed on the horizon that were as long as millennia. Maybe it was the isolation I felt for being the single conscious human being that had ever traveled as far into our heliosphere as to reach its fringes. Or maybe it was that damned sound that played tricks on my mind, making me feel like I was stuck in a perpetual rainy day in a mechanical palace back on Earth. Whatever the psychology behind my miserable state, I was still convinced of the reality of my surroundings. Being clear-headed was one of the characteristics that cosmonauts had to possess to be chosen for this mission. Retrospectively, I might have known exactly what to say and how to act to pass those tests back on Earth. However, I'm firm of the conviction that no one can objectively know at this point in time how anyone can react to being sent so far away from home with the presumption of making first contact. No one. I was still unable to see the extraplanetary vessel, nor could the scans pierce through its outer shell to get readings from its interior. To say that I was nervous about that would be a definite understatement. The onboard AI, my only companion, my source of information and inspiration, had alarmed me to the fact that we were, at that point, only 72 hours away from the extraplanetary vessel, and no one else was out of cryosleep still. Furthermore, it said to me that if our course was not piloted properly in the next 24 hours, we would certainly crash into the massive spaceship that hailed from God knows where. Surely, I thought at first, this cannot be the way the first mission to the fringes of the heliosphere ends. To make matters worse, our messages and logs would take ages to arrive back on Earth. And by that point, who knows if they would even care enough about space exploration to deduce what this vessel was. For all I knew, the aliens might have still been alive and waiting for us to discover them. I could only imagine how they would understand a ship hurtling toward them on a head-on collision course. An active war? They've been waiting for us for 1,000 years, keeping the utmost distance imaginable, so such a scenario would be an act of unprovoked hostility from our side. Even from my current perspective, the panic I felt was completely justifiable. I wasn't at all worried about my own possible demise or that of my crew, but the potential of starting a war with a species we haven't even met. The predicament was made even harder by the constant sound of an impossible rain falling on the sides of the hull. I should have been used to it by then. However, its irregular pattern and inexplicable origin made me feel very on edge. My mood was in a constant flux between anger, annoyance, and petrifying fear. I had to find a way to open those damned cryo chambers. I had to do it if it was the last thing I did. At that moment, a few hours before the deadline for our course correction, I was unhinged just enough to be ready for anything. Since, thankfully, I am not an idiot, the first chamber I tried my techniques with had one of the other mission specialists inside. He was an astronomer who loved playing the piano back on Earth and was genuinely a good guy. But he wasn't pivotal to the mission at this point. I couldn't risk accidentally killing the captain or the pilot for that matter. First, I tried smashing the chamber window open with a makeshift bat made from the metal in the captain's chair. An impossible thunder struck the ship the moment I took the bat to the chamber. Lucky for my friend inside, the glass was just thick enough to not break. Otherwise, it probably would have gone right through his skull. Secondly, after further reasoning with the AI proved completely ineffective, I tried frying the circuitry of the astronomer's cryo chamber, hoping that once it was out of power, it would start up the security protocols and wake him. It didn't. I had to watch him suffocate in his sleep. However, with no time to despair about his loss, I thought what needs to be done is to turn off the power in the entire cryo section of the horizon to, activate the emergency waking procedures. The ship might have thought that only one of us was expendable, but the entire crew? I doubted that highly. I gave myself an hour to think about it more thoroughly. However, it wasn't exactly time I could afford. But deciding the fate of 11 more people, or even 12 counting myself, it had to be examined. After I found the controls that regulated the influx of power to the section of the horizon holding the cryo chambers, I sat down and I did my damned best at being as clear-headed as possible. It was tough. What if I ended up killing the rest of them like the astronomer? Or what if there was always another way that I couldn't think of at the moment, and I ended up completely disrupting their brain functions if they didn't die in the process? The cryo dreams are such a delicate ecosystem of technology and metaphysics that I wasn't sure if I should even attempt detaching the remaining crew from it. On the other hand, as wrong and terrible as switching the power off might have gone, we were still on a collision course with the extraplanetary object. How much worse could it possibly get? I wished I was still in Cryo La La Land. For a split second, I even considered it. At first, my idea was to simply return to my cryo chamber and perish with the rest, with no remorse as to the consequences of the collision with the alien vessel. The burden of the decision would have stopped being mine. It would have stopped the moment I would enter the cryo dream. Right? Yeah, right. God, I affirmed it for myself, dubiously disregarding all kinds of ethical intricacies that surrounded such an option. However, as I kept thinking about it, about my situation for the past 10-ish days, a little nagging question appeared in my mind. What if I never left Cryosleep? Would that not solve all of my mysteries? Would that not answer the most pressing question of why I was the only one to wake? A cryo nightmare. My dear AI compatriot couldn't, or wouldn't, do anything to help me. The only thing it could and would do was to keep informing me every 10 minutes of my impending doom, should I not wake the pilot. I wanted to talk to it, to talk my decision out with it. Maybe I would even want to ask it if I were even awake. But what good would that do me? Funny. As opposed to anthropomorphizing as I was, my mind still wanted to do just that in my hour of desperation and utter solitude. We didn't even give the onboard AI a name. Also, my doing. I wanted to teach my crew what communicating with a non-human would be like, so that they would be ready, should we make some kind of contact with whatever it was we had imagined back then that piloted the alien vessel. With my hour for contemplation almost over, the AI informed me, "Scans of the Oort cloud concluded." I had completely forgotten about those. And for a moment, I even stopped registering the pestering rain and thunder that continued hitting the hull of the horizon as a phantom echo of a world far behind me. I shouldn't have checked the readings. I should have stayed in my lane and focused on making my ultimate decision before it was made for me by sheer haste. In retrospect, I couldn't have hoped to possibly understand the readings. I already killed our astronomer, so the only ones capable of even deciphering what our AI had gathered about the Oort cloud were over 7 trillion kilometers away. The 48th hour to our approach, rather collision, with the vessel was upon me finally. There was no more time for decisions. I acted on impulse and yanked the levers on the power controls for the cryo chambers. I gave it a few moments. The chambers lost power and went dark. Nothing else happened. No chamber door opened. No human face peered at me from inside the chambers. I was utterly devastated and lost all willpower to even stand and check the cryo chambers. Suddenly, the alarms of the horizon began blaring. The AI was telling me to get into an escape pod and abandon ship. In a moment of sheer panic and self-preservation, I leaped up and ran toward the pods. For some reason, the rain and thunder had intensified to abnormal levels. The sound was so amplified that it was almost hurting my ears and gave me an instant migraine. It was louder than the alarms. When I finally approached the pods and saw all 13 of them laid out in the bay, it hit me. I would be leaving my colleagues, my crewmates, my friends in this terra incognita, in a state between life and death. I wasn't even sure if the emergency protocols kicked in and kept them inside the cryo chambers instead of reviving them. With no time and no ability to think straight anymore, I jumped inside the first escape pod and got ready to power it up. However, I wasn't that lucky. There was no simple escape for me. Nothing would end up being simple for me on this mission. The moment I pressed the switch, all power in the horizon was cut off. The pod wasn't responding to my commands either. There was complete and utter darkness, filled with the dreadful sound of rain and thunder. After a few moments like that, I realized that my eyes were closed and that there was actual light around me. I opened my eyes and I found myself back in my cryo chamber. So it was all a cryo nightmare. Not quite. Maybe? I felt like my brain was displaced from my body, like I wasn't myself. Like I wasn't in complete control of my faculties, physical or intellectual. I'd read somewhere that long periods of time in a cryo chamber can make the person waking from cryosleep feel that way. Suddenly I realized that the hatch wasn't opening as it had in my previous stint in cryosleep. However, as panic began to take over about being trapped inside a cryo chamber, I should have been more scared of what was out there. On some instinctive level that wasn't instantly registering in my conscious mind, my eyes must have begun scanning what was barely discernible from the window of the chamber. Then it struck, the true horror, the biggest fear I could imagine, bigger than waking in a dysfunctional cryo chamber. I wasn't on the horizon anymore. Have I been transported to another place? When? Where? For the time it took me to open the hatch before my air ran out, I was trying to understand where my cryo chamber had been moved. However, my question was truly answered the moment that it finally opened. The bright lights in the unrecognizable room were almost blinding, and all I could see was a tall figure looming over me. It did not look human, and when I took another glance at the design of the place I was in, I realized that it wasn't man-made. I had been transported to the alien vessel together with my cryo chamber. The question remained if the rest were transported as well. This sounded like the right question at the time, but it would prove to be the wrong question. The alien thing towering over my chamber had a humanoid figure. Its face seemed as if it was in perpetual anguish, showcasing an experience of terror only a being from outside of our solar system can experience. There I was, anthropomorphizing again. Furthermore, my human mind was interpreting its language and gestures as stress and panic. I kept falling in a cognitive loop that I distinctly told my crewmates some years ago when we started our mission not to fall into, once we reached the vessel and possibly made contact. My gut, however, kept telling me the same thing. The alien was looking directly at me with its 3 massive white eyes that barely had pupils, while its lips were contorting in some indiscernible tongue. I think it seemed to be under the impression that if it kept speaking to me, I would somehow begin understanding it. I'm good at my job, but I'm not a wizard. I was half expecting it to begin raising its voice at me as if saying the things louder would make me understand them better. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that this strange creature was trying to tell me something awful, something that seemed to be horrifying it to the point of stupidity. I wasn't afraid of the creature. No, I was afraid of what it was desperately trying to tell me. After it finally grasped that I couldn't magically begin to understand its words. It grabbed me by the arm and yanked me out of the cryo chamber. The alien was taking me to another part of the ship, holding my arm so tightly that I could barely feel it anymore. After a few moments, I realized that blood was dripping from the place where it had grabbed. I looked at its hand holding mine and noticed that it had 3 talon-like fingers covered in fur, digging into my flesh and tearing my skin. Little blood droplets fell on the metal floor of the ship, like breadcrumbs leading the way to wherever it was taking me. I don't think it was aware it was hurting me, and I was too confused and dizzy from cryosleep to react. We passed corridor upon corridor from the massive ship without coming across any other creature like it. Has it been alone here all this time? Or was the vessel just so enormous that one could spend a lifetime without seeing another soul? The corridors were built with a single creature passing through them in mind. The ceiling was as high as the alien and as narrow as to only let its skinny figure pass through. I was being pulled behind it, just barely squeezing through the corridors, feeling a little claustrophobic and very nauseous still, and the alien wouldn't shut up. Suddenly we came upon a large room with even higher ceilings and cold air rushing through it. As we entered, I noticed the difference in air quality, and my nausea began dissipating almost immediately. The moment we stepped inside, bright yellow lights came on in the room, which was as big as a Horizon deck. Surely this must have been one of the smaller ones there? It was almost empty, though very similar to the one we left behind with my cryo chamber inside. Come to think of it, I didn't see any other chamber in that room. Nothing else was there that looked like human technology. It seemed as though only my cryo chamber was transported to the extraplanetary vessel. Then I noticed it. Right in the center of this new room, where the alien had taken me so hastily, was another man-made cryo chamber. I pulled my arm out of the alien's grasp and ran toward the chamber. It was identical to my own. Coming closer and closer to it, I was happy that another one of my crew had survived. Assuming that our ship was wrecked upon collision with the alien vessel, there may be others in different rooms just like this one, I thought. Those were just fleeting moments of happiness, however. That ended the moment I arrived at the chamber and peered through its frozen window. The person sleeping inside of it, it was me. At first, I was completely unbelieving. I cleared the window from the ice with my bloodied hand and glued myself to it. It really was me. I was looking at myself in a chamber absolutely identical to my own. I took a step back and saw my name written on the side. Next to my name was the ticking clock of the chamber in Earth years. The year it was showing was 3531. I freaked out and began banging on the damned chamber. What the hell was happening? All of a sudden, I felt the alien grabbing me to stop me from destroying the chamber, and what seemed like an alarm began booming in the massive room. Bright, violent lights shined in and out, and the sound of heavy rain and thunder filled the room. My mind gave out, and I fell unconscious on the alien vessel, located at the very edge of our heliosphere.
Mission Specialist Clark, log number 1094.65, Earth year 2531. I have awakened from cryosleep mere hours ago. I'm very nauseous and can barely keep my eyes open. The horizon doesn't seem to be ready for me, or any of us, yet, the rest of the crew is in stasis. I expect them to be awake any moment now, though the captain and pilot should have been awake long ago. Our approach toward the extraplanetary vessel that had emerged from the Oort cloud some 1,000 years ago is steady. We have about 13 days at current speed to reach its location. Horizon stats are nominal.
Alone, Hannah journeyed space, traveling from world to world, gathering history to sell to those who shared her fascination with things as they were before. Some days were busy, either with customers or with finding items, learning their history to be passed on to those who purchased each item. They wouldn't leave without everything she could give them. Others were quiet, often the ones where she was in space, making the journey from one place to the next. Then there were the more unusual days, when someone came in searching for something special. Special, however, was different for everyone. Hannah docked at one of the colonies she'd traveled to often. One of her regular customers there was always on the hunt for more. His interest wasn't exactly the same as hers, but it was enough for her to choose to sell to him. Like always, he stepped in the moment Hannah opened her shop, slowly making his way through the ship, looking at everything she'd bought. She waited. Patience was one of the most important things, giving them the time to search. They might find what they were looking for. He, however, kept moving, searching through everything she'd brought back until he reached the counter. Their eyes met. Hannah knew a little about him from snippets he'd shared of his family, and she smiled. "It's a pleasure to see you again. How's your family?" Smiling back, he nodded. "Good, thanks, and it's nice to see you again." He gestured. "Do you have anything to share with me?" "Always." Hannah studied him. "Were you looking for anything specific today, or just once more on the hunt for the unusual?" "You know me well. The unusual." He glanced back at the shelves. "From the looks of things, you had a lot of luck." "I did." Running her tongue over her bottom lip, Hannah stepped away from the counter to where she kept those things she held back, for those who were specifically looking for them. Remember, things aren't always how they appear to be. Fortunately, it was a lesson he'd learnt before, during his times in the shop. Some of the others would get angry, believing Hannah was the reason for whatever happened, and when that happened, she'd make certain they couldn't enter again. It wasn't something she would accept in her space. When a purchase was made, she was always open. Honesty was the safest policy, yet there were those who didn't accept the truth. They didn't understand what they bought might not fulfill their dreams. When the item they'd bought failed them, they'd return, wanting a refund, telling Hannah she owed it to them, when she didn't. They knew if they tried to claim back their money through legal channels, they'd be told they'd made the decision, and it wasn't as though she made promises. Buyer beware, especially when it came to items from the old world, as it was so easy for lies to be told, before becoming the truth. On one of the shelves was a box. Hannah took it, walking back to him, placing it on the counter. He looked at the box for a moment, then at her. "What's inside?" "According to the person I bought it from, it's an indestructible ball, found in the ruins of a lost empire." Hannah opened the box, showing the ball to him. It was bright orange, and from the beginning, it had been hard to believe it was truly indestructible. From what I could tell, they were passing on a story they'd been told, so I delved more deeply. The lost empire was old. From what had been learned, the archaeologists delving deeply into who they were, they had some very unusual technologies. Although it may not seem like it, this may be connected with one of them. However, there's an equal chance it existed as a prank item. Other balls similar to this one were found. Some were in places they believed would have been hidden away to be found by someone within their family, but it's not something they chose to test. For them, these items were important to keep hold of. There was one accident where the ball was poked and it caused it to break. What was within it? Unfortunately for me, they didn't say. Hannah shrugged. "I can't even be certain this was originally created by that empire. This may be a recreation by those who came later." Nodding, he studied the ball, knowing better than to touch it. He could pay for it and then touch it, but he knew better than to think he was going to get his money back, as Hannah told him everything she knew about it. Finally, nodding, he reached into his pocket, taking out his card. Because the other thing she'd learnt about him was that he had money to be able to buy whatever he wanted, even if it ended up being nothing. Passing it over to her, not asking how much it was, his eyes stayed on it as Hannah took his payment. Then, when it was through, she placed the card close to him so he could take it should he wanted to. It seemed right then as though he didn't. Carefully, he took the ball out of the box, rolling it in his hands. Hannah watched. She leaned back against the wall slightly, seeing what he planned on doing with it. Was he going to see if it truly was indestructible? Bouncing it on the counter, something she hadn't tested herself, he then ran his fingers over it, poking it slightly. Maybe he thought it was one of the prank balls, hoping he might understand it. Finally, it happened. He found the right spot, and the ball didn't burst but instead seemed to completely disappear, leaving them with nothing more than a smell and a sound. Raising an eyebrow, he looked at Hannah. Was that what I think it was? Yes, I think it was. There are those within every civilization who find farts amusing. Laughing, he nodded, picking up the box. It went into his pocket, potentially as a reminder of what he'd spent his money on. That wasn't something he'd ever get back. At least he didn't blame her for not warning him he might be entirely wasting his money on nothing. He knew that. There were never any certainties. Do you have anything else? I always have something else. Are you looking for anything specific? No, I don't think I am. He slowly looked around. You always seem to have something I haven't thought of, and I'd like one of those. With a nod, Hannah stepped into the back, where some of the larger items were, drawing the person-sized wax figure out through the door. You may be interested in this. From Earth? There was a flicker of excitement in his eyes, until she shook her head. It's not one of the wax celebrities. Oh, it's a wax person, but not in the way you imagine. Hannah placed it beside her, choosing not to look at it. There was a time when she'd kept her eyes on it all the time, just in case, because she knew what was meant to happen. I can share the story with you if you're interested. There was a moment when she thought he might say no, but then he nodded, eyes on it. Would this be a piece of interesting history? Hannah smiled. It would. She ran her tongue over her bottom lip, trying to find the right place to start with it. The person who sold it to me was old, much older than both of us, choosing to finally give up on the possibility he might be able to find a way to save the woman he once loved. Even if he did find a way, it was likely she'd be the age she'd been when she was first transformed, so they were never going to be able to have any kind of future. So, you're telling me this wax figure was once actually a person? From what he said it was. Hannah glanced at the figure. I have no reason not to believe what he said, as Rebecca was a member of a research colony, sent out to explore a world they believed had never been inhabited. She sighed. There is a chance it wasn't. From the records, it seems like there were possible sites. But they may have been groups sent like the researchers before anyone truly settled. Journals he shared with me while I was there, he was unwilling to part with due to him wanting to be able to remember Rebecca, especially as he hoped to be able to pass them on to a museum at some point. I don't know if that will happen. He seemed, well, broken, to be honest, which is understandable if the story he told me was true. She breathed in deeply. There were regular messages sent back for a time, as the researchers learnt more about this world, talking about certain strange flora and fauna they'd come across. Exploring other worlds was something Rebecca loved doing too much to settle down, which was why the two of them hadn't yet married, but it was something they'd talked about being a possibility in the future. She wanted him to go with her, only he wasn't quite ready to give up everything to do that. I think it's a choice he regretted, after what happened. He was angry and disappointed with himself for not being there when it happened, because at least then they would have been together, although then they'd have both ended up in the same position. Being honest with him didn't seem like the right thing, considering how emotional he was. Having been in love myself, I can understand the emotions. Blinking, her customer looked at the figure, shaking his head. If that was my wife. He raked a hand through his hair. Letting her go would have been impossible, even as a wax figure. Yes, I think I might have felt the same way. Hannah stared at nothing for a moment, trying not to think too much about what was lost to time, before returning to the story. No one's quite certain what did happen. There were records kept, as things slowly started to change, and Rebecca's journal held the most information, something he thought might help him to be able to save her from this fate. The others, well, they were wax. She reached out with one hand, touching Rebecca's arm gently. Some were lost, while others ended up in the hands of people who did everything, without knowing if everything was actually going to be enough. The problem came from understanding how it happened. When the time came, there were no more messages. They sent out a group to find out what had happened to the researchers. At first, there was nothing. Had things stayed that way, it's possible we would never have learnt what happened to them. Instead, there was suddenly a flicker of heat, like someone was down there, which led to them making the journey down. Reaching where the researchers had settled, there were no other signs of life. They walked into the main building, which happened to be right in the middle of the small settlement. Hearing him talk about it, what it was like to enter that building, when they had no idea what had happened to anyone within. Had they died? Was there some other reason for them not sending out messages any longer? Honestly, this isn't something I imagined could have crossed any of their minds. Why would it? She looked at Rebecca once more. At first, they didn't know what they were looking at. Some of the figures were standing, the way Rebecca is, while others were sitting, although we can't know if that's the position they started off in. One of them became flesh and blood in front of their eyes, something that only happened for a second, a sigh that something entirely unexpected had happened. Their first task, they knew, was to understand what exactly had happened, because they were worried removing the figures from the settlement might affect them in some way. He explained it as wanting them to be safe, an understandable choice, with each of them having once been people. People who had families, and those families needed to be told what happened. The reason he was there, searching for her, was due to him having made the decision he couldn't stay away. He had to be there to learn the truth, however complicated it might be. Seeing Rebecca standing at one of the computers, finally putting all the pieces together, the first thing he did was start going through everything she wrote. Little by little, he was able to piece together the story of what happened to the group, and why they didn't leave when they first worked out what was happening. They did have time when they could have left. Instead, they stayed, believing they'd be able to find a solution to what was happening to them. By the time they realized it wasn't going to happen, it was too late. Anyone who could have got them to safety had been transformed. Rebecca kept trying to learn more, in case someone did start looking for them, trying to explain the experience, and told them it was best for all of them to leave the world before anything happened to them. There was no way of knowing how long it would take for it to happen to others. She was the last to change? By her own words, she did everything she could to fight against the transformation, even though there was no doubt in her mind it was coming. Not after she watched everyone, she made the journey with change into wax, slowly losing their bodies, all of them doing anything they could to cling on to normality. I can't imagine what it must have been like. Neither could I, but the choice they made to stay in order to learn might have ended the same way. Hannah raked a hand through her hair, leaning back to make it easier to look at Rebecca, feeling closer to her than before. Being given a chance to share the story changed everything. It wasn't something they realized straight away, the same way the researchers hadn't. They, I think, expected there to be something that transformed them, only that didn't seem to be the case. There's a chance it might have been the planet itself, although I don't believe it was the case. Rebecca didn't either. Hannah studied the figure, thinking of the pictures of the woman she'd once been. She didn't ever come to a conclusion, possibly because her fight ended before she could, but there were a couple of theories she had, with one of them being linked to certain food they were eating. Food somehow transforming them all into wax? He shook his head. I'm not certain I would agree with the theory, but then I wasn't there. How am I to know what happened to her? Has she moved at any point? Although I've never seen it happen, he had, which might have been wishful thinking. He wanted her to still be in there somewhere, and there's a chance she is, listening to us talk about her now. Only she has no way to speak to either of us, because she's trapped within this wax form. Maybe in becoming one of them, she even learned how it happened. While I was making the journey back here, I talked to her occasionally, wondering if there might ever come a time when she talked back. But it never happened. I didn't think it would, and there were never any signs she had moved. There's a chance she might when she's with you, should you wish to make the purchase, unless you've made the decision you'd rather not. Share the rest of the story. I believe I will purchase Rebecca, even if she never moves, because the story... He shook his head. I don't know how to put the feelings into words right now. Neither do I. Hannah smiled. I understand what you're feeling, which is why I made the choice to add her to my shop, rather than walking away. Normally I would have done. Something like this feels a little closer to slavery than I'd like. But then I thought about the possibilities for her. Maybe if she's lucky, she'll end up in the hands of someone who'll do what they can to help her. or she'll find herself somewhere what was done to her is naturally undone. Is that something you truly believe is possible? Anything is possible. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Rebecca was young when she transformed, a woman who believed she had her whole life ahead of her, but it didn't happen. Instead, this was her fate. Yet there's something more to it, I'm certain of that, and at some point in the future, everything is going to change for her. He looked at Hannah and she could see the doubt in his eyes. Why would he think someone who'd become wax had any chance of a different life? If someone who had his entire life to find an answer couldn't, what makes you think anyone else will find a different solution? Our understanding of the universe is changing all the time. This may well be another case where someone finds the solution. I don't know whether they will, but I think it's worth giving those who are still here a chance. The others, well, that's one of the more complicated parts of the story. They melted. Seems to have been the case. Rebecca and a few of the others were protected from that, while the others, well, they didn't get as lucky, unfortunately. I hate talking about this around her in case she can hear what we're saying. They were her colleagues, her friends, and the people she did everything she could to help. But I don't think they ever truly stood a chance of finding the solution. Like I said, when the others arrived, the first things they found told them they should leave. Gather everything they could and get off the planet before anything bad happened to them. But they didn't truly believe it was possible the same thing would happen to them. Had I been there, I'm not certain I would have done either, because it seemed like an impossibility to begin with, only to find themselves in a position they couldn't possibly understand. Neither could the researchers, and they were the ones who had a better chance, considering the things they'd done before. Rebecca and her colleagues had been on multiple planets in the past where unusual things had been found, but it was never like this. They'd never found themselves in a position where they became something else entirely. As she was flesh for the longest, she did see the others as they occasionally became flesh, something that happened more often in the early days, until it only happened once a day at most. Even when it was happening more often, she didn't have a chance to speak with them, to ask what they were going through while they were wax, because they weren't flesh for long enough. What she could share was the slow transformation she went through, hours passing before she wasn't able to type anymore. But she kept talking, trying to hold on, trying to find something that would help. I know they didn't send out any requests for help, because they didn't know if simply stepping onto the planet would be enough to change someone. Rebecca wondered more than once in her notes whether they were lost from the beginning, so they never had any chance of being able to leave the planet. Due to those who saved the researchers, never transforming it appears that wasn't the case. They did leave within weeks, however, when the first of the group transformed into wax, never mentioning they were feeling anything at all. Only that was probably because they had no way of knowing what was actually happening to them, as they hadn't read Rebecca's journal. She did say the experience was slightly different for everyone, but there were some similarities. There were those who were worried being in close proximity to one of the figures would be enough to change them, something that doesn't appear to be the case, as I've been traveling with Rebecca for several months now, and I haven't been through the transformation. I believe it does prove it was to do with the planet, rather than the people who found themselves there. It took months to happen originally, with the first transformation of the new arrivals happening much sooner, a sign the power of whatever it was that made it happen was growing, potentially due to it changing so many people into wax. Although, to be honest, I'm not certain this is exactly what we would call wax. Simply a close enough word to use to describe it, especially as it does react similarly to heat and light. The purchaser of Rebecca does need to be careful should they wish to keep her for any length of time. I made certain she was somewhere cool, but not so cold it might have cracked her, as that can also happen. I looked at some of the pictures of the others who were affected by not being in the hands of the right people. He did keep an eye on those he could, remembering stories Rebecca told him about each of them, how their lives had entwined through the years, until the time came when they were all transformed together. The first to go was the leader of the research expedition, mentioning a couple of days before it happened, he wasn't feeling well, but it wasn't until later they were able to put the pieces together. When he didn't get up that morning, they assumed he needed to rest, so they didn't check on him until lunchtime, which was when they found him sitting on the edge of his bed, looking like he'd just finished putting his boots on. Rebecca's entry from that day was terrifying. They had no idea what was going on, whether it would happen to anyone else, but they made the decision to stay to try to find help for him. From there, it passed on to the 3 people who were able to get them off the planet, who all had some experience with the spacecraft they'd used to make the journey. She couldn't help wondering if that meant whatever was happening had made the choice to go for the 4 people they needed the most first, although that would mean there was some kind of sentience, and that didn't seem to be a thought she liked much, although it linked into something she found while she was out searching the other potential settlements. None of them believed there had ever been anyone living there, yet there were signs of people at least having traveled there in the past, with one of them leaving something behind, the very last words of a note. "It's not safe." There was no way of knowing what it linked to, but she held on to that memory until the time came when she realized the world they'd traveled to wasn't safe. Arriving there, those were the first words he read, followed by "leave fast. Gather everything and get away from here before anything can happen to you." Something they should have listened to. Making the choice to ignore it was the worst mistake they could have made, as it meant one of their group was also transformed. It might have been more than one, a kind of disbelief having hit the group, not entirely willing to believe what was happening was real, something Rebecca also described. She was one of 3 people arguing they needed to get away from the planet sooner rather than later because there was something strange going on. Only the others were focused on trying to find a solution, and the 3 gave up, realizing they couldn't make it happen. Instead, they simply had to live with things as they were. Unfortunately, it was what Rebecca believes led to the loss of their pilots, and it was then the panic hit the others as they realized how bad things truly were. He used that information to convince his group they needed to leave, no matter how little they might have wanted to, taking both of the spacecrafts with them in order to make certain they could get everyone off the planet. Otherwise, they'd have had to leave people behind. None of the wax people weighed as much as they would have done in their flesh forms, something that was to be expected. Rebecca talked about how the transformation changed them, how complicated everything was, and then the sensations she felt as she slowly became wax. It didn't happen quickly, but as it started to happen, she felt this lassitude sweeping through herself, enough to keep any of them from yelling for help. Had they done it, might have saved them all. Slowly nodding, he stepped closer to the counter, looking at Rebecca more closely than he had done before. "I don't understand how an entire person, every part of them, would become wax. There are no answers I can give you. Just shared the story with you so you understand who she is, because I want her to end up in the hands of the right buyer. I want you to care for her. She is precious, even if there is no possible way to save her from this fate. Yes, she is." He gestured at the card that was still on the counter. "I feel like there's still so much to the story." "Oh, there were pages of it, and I've barely been able to share any of it with you." Hannah put her hand on the card. "I have to be certain. This is what you want to do. Buying Rebecca, a woman who has become wax, feels like something I need to do, like I was meant to walk in here, to find her." He shrugged. "Does that sound as stupid as I think it does?" "No, it doesn't, because I felt the same way." Her eyes met with his for a moment. "There are people I said no to before, when they said they were interested in her. I said I'd been traveling with her for months, and that's the reason for it. So I found a person who had a similar connection to her. She may not seem like it now, but she was someone. And she had people who loved her. At times, I was uncomfortable around her, because I felt like I was using her for profit when I'm not. What I want is to find her a home with someone who understands, especially with it being possible there might be a solution. I know there are people out there hunting for it, due to it being their father who was taken from them by the planet." Hannah took a small booklet out of her pocket, putting it on the counter. "What is that?" "A way for you to connect with the others, should you wish to. It's not something you have to do, but it will help you learn more about what happened to her, and potentially learn if they do ever find a way to transform someone from wax into flesh once more." Nodding, he picked it up, slipping it into his pocket. "I assume she's not going to be cheap. For her protection, my price was set at a certain point. I believe you will make the right choices with her, even though it might end up being a mistake, and so she will be a little cheaper. Please do what you can to keep her safe, to potentially find a way to help her, and make certain she's passed on from one generation to the next." "I will." As she took the money from his card once more, Hannah returned it to him, before going to the exit to the counter, gently carrying Rebecca with her. "There is a chance she will move?" Yes, there is. And some of the others even tried to talk. This may happen if she does move. I don't know. Hannah looked at Rebecca one last time. If it ever happens, I'd like to know about it. For her, I think it's much less likely, due to the choice she made to fight for so long. Probably. She seems like the kind of person who gave up those moments in the hope she might find a solution for the people she cared about. Just as gently, he took hold of her, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. You weren't wrong when you said she didn't weigh as much. One mistake, and she could melt or crack. I'm trusting you with her. For some, she'd just be another curiosity, but I hope you'll treat her well. Both of you have my promise that I will do what I can to protect her, and should it be possible, help her. Watching him walk away with Rebecca, Hannah was almost certain she'd made the right choice. Before he stepped through the door, Hannah was almost certain Rebecca's human eyes met with hers. The gratefulness within them, something she hoped she wasn't imagining. Sighing, she stepped over to the door, closing up the shop for the day. Maybe her sister had finally found someone who could help her.
How had it gotten like this? To say I do not quite remember would be me doing my memory a disservice, even though I wished now more than anything that I could just forget. Forget what I had gone through. Forget what they passed through. But I still remember the sounds and their pleas. I remember the putrid smell that invaded my nostrils and threatened to drive me insane. The rotten smell from a being that rid me of the one thing I held dear. How did it begin again? Yes, it started with darkness, as most things did. My mind, like space, was filled with darkness and nothingness, and it remained that way until the void's consistency was perturbed. Piloted by a crew of 7, our ship, the Phoenix Ark, floated through the expanding void of space as it made its way to Gria W94. We had been away from Earth for 8 months. We had just been woken from our cryogenic sleep by the monotonous beeping of the Phoenix Ark. I was awake. My recovery time from cryogenic sleep was slower than back on Earth. This was no drill. Where the others took some minutes to get over the drowsiness and discombobulating effect of the cryogenic sleep, it took me almost a seeming eternity to get over it. The semi-autonomous systems had put off the artificial gravity at our re-emergence as a protective measure in case we grew faint and fell. It also served as a means of faster navigation through the ship. The others didn't take long to begin floating and stretching as recommended. Me, I tucked myself into the corner and tried to weather the onset of what was surely a pounding migraine. "William, are you okay?" Concerned Annika, the chief engineer, asked even as she futilely tried to stifle the excitement in her voice from all the floating she and the others were doing. "Good," I answered abruptly before I sent her back to floating. My body was simply reacting poorly to being let out of a freezer after 8 months. After the worst had passed, I angled my head up, looked past my floating crew, and ogled the interior of the ship we were floating in. The Phoenix, or as it was more commonly known, the Phoenix Ark, was the 3rd iteration of ships engineered by NASA as part of the Phoenix program. I chuckled a bit at the irony. The program and ship had been part of another failed program called the BBB program. The BBB program had been scrapped. According to some pundits, it had been a total failure. especially considering its lackluster performance versus the amount of money that went into it. The program had been such a failure that it had triggered a round of firing and replacements in the organization. After the storm from the old program had passed, a new program to explore the stars was born. The Phoenix program came to be in demand following the discovery of the new planet, Gria W94. The new world was a mystery, as it had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, as that part of space had been ranked over to them. Caught in my thoughts about the bureaucratic affairs, I stayed in the corner seat for a while before unbuckling the belt that kept me grounded and commanded a systems check. We were getting closer to the planet, and the last thing we wanted was the ship falling apart because we were too preoccupied with floating in space. We began clearing each part of the ship, one after another, and before long, we could say the Phoenix was in proper working order. It had been a reason to breathe a sigh of relief, but Luca didn't think so. "I have a bad feeling," he said. Of course, I thought to myself, he always did. Why, I asked, even though I was convinced it was just superstition. "We're nearing Gria W94. Not only are we behind schedule, he pointed to one of the screens in his space, keeps going haywire. Plus, I had a dream." Luca was the second mate, so the news about the equipment wasn't something to be overlooked. I drew closer and checked his readings. "Isn't that normal for the amount of disruption we just had?" I asked. "It is, but..." "It is nothing," I said rather harshly than I had intended the words to be. I did my best as captain to reassure him. Our mission was to orbit the planet, deploy the capsule carrying the rover, and nothing more. As for the dream, it had been said that there were no dreams in space. I couldn't tell how true that was. I had problems dreaming, as I hadn't dreamt in years. The last dream I had was as a 7-year-old boy. "There are no dreams up here," I said to him. "Only abstractions of space. As for being behind schedule, don't worry. We will make up for the delay soon." He looked at me with eyes that told me he wanted to say more reasons why he didn't feel right about our mission. I looked at him with eyes that told him I didn't care to hear more about his superstition. I should have listened. At that moment, I should have aborted the mission and made a return trip to Earth. But I didn't. To say the mission hadn't gone as planned was an understatement. The truth, in retrospect, was that no one could be blamed for how the ship went down. The planet we found ourselves on was cruel. We didn't just know it yet, but we would. With each passing sound, with each individual strand of breeze, we would know. One of us was dead already. It wasn't long before we came into range with the Gria W94. The discovery of the planet had been one that sparked a lot of debates. First, the planet had been discovered. An observatory had announced the discovery of an intrusion in the night sky. Still, they couldn't quite determine what it was. The likelihood of a new planet brought issues, with several governments accusing each other of drumming up planets where there were none. It had taken building a special telescope for taking pictures to get the arguments to stop, and even then, it hadn't. Some still needed verification that the images being sent were not an afterimage of some sort or flaring from heat. An orbiter and a rover had also been sent, before it could be announced as official. The way I saw it, the orbiting flight and the deployment of a new and improved rover, we were the fifth wave of confirmation. Looking at the planet, there was no doubt in my mind that the planet was real. The sight in front of my eyes had a chaotic beauty that neither the crew nor I could explain. The planet's hue hadn't been that far off from what the telescopes, the rovers, and the mechs had sent back in the early days of the discovery. Our job was now to take a lap around the planet, just like the president had described in his press brief. But even in this trance brought about by the beauty of the planet, I felt a chill run down my spine that I couldn't explain. This was my second warning, but I failed to listen. "Let's earn our pay," I ordered, putting aside the shudder. Everyone was at their station. We began a slow descent so as not to get caught up in an orbit stronger than the Phoenix could handle. I looked at the readings as the Ark disengaged from the autopilot. "Ease into it," I said to Hayden as I asked Luca for the readings. The mission's success couldn't afford a mistake where we entered an orbit where the planet's pull was stronger. Luca called out, and the reading, the Phoenix was about to move to the lower, and that was when it happened. The pull suddenly became stronger. "Pull it up! Pull it up!" I ordered, and the reply came that it couldn't be pulled up from, and that was when we nosedived into the planet.
"Brace for impact."
The Phoenix system blared out.
"Brace for impact."
Although the Phoenix made it into the planet, the nightmare hadn't ended. Every crevice in the Phoenix Ark creaked from the vast amount of pressure pressing down on them. Instinctively, I shouted some commands. We had to make it down safely, but we didn't. The Phoenix crashed. Time, marked only by the cacophony of beeps, seemed to last for another eternity in the surrounding darkness. The more I tried to open my eyes to let light in, the more things seemed to fade away beyond any graspable meaning. It was the cryogenic sleep all over again, but with more pain and a fricking headache that threatened to consume my very being. The more I tried to will myself back to consciousness, the more it evaded me. Without opening my eyes, I looked up, and there it was. Something looking back at me before I could peer into the darkness. Annika's voice woke me up. Her voice was followed by a series of beeps that rang throughout the hull of the Phoenix. I woke, and everywhere seemed to be covered in darkness. I couldn't tell if this was just how things were, or if my sight was still recovering. It turned out to be the latter. I knew when the emergency lights came on. Somehow, the ship had landed without totally falling apart. Groping my way through the ship, I searched for the buttons and engaged the emergency light. They came on with a buzz akin to that of a bug zapper. "Can someone put off that fucking noise?" The beep slowly faded after that. We began a sound-off to ensure everyone was okay. Everyone had spoken, except for Oscar. Madison had tried but failed to resuscitate him. We had to bury him, as the cryopods were no longer functional. "What happened there?" I asked Hayden after wiping a tear from my eyes. "I don't know," he said as he removed Madison's hand and held the bandage in the bloodied place. "You should ask Luca," he said with irritation ringing through every syllable he spoke. Wordlessly, I turned and looked at Luca. "I don't know. It felt like something was pulling the ship. Not again with the superstition crap, I said, tired of hearing about his feelings. I mean it, William. Something was pulling, driving the readings all over the place. That would be you, moving us into the orbit we were supposed to avoid, Hayden replied. There isn't any need to fight, Annika said as she stepped into the middle. She reminded us that although the mission had gone a bit sideways, we were still on a mission, and Oscar would have wanted us to complete it. She was right. We needed to assess our condition. Finish the mission, I mouthed. Captain? That might be easier said than done, a voice came from behind. Why? What is it this time? It seems we've lost the payload. Great, I said. Just great. After assessing the ship, it turned out that the rough landing had injured the ship to the extent that it would take days to repair. Dark here was tricky. The darkness here wasn't like the dark back on Earth. It fluttered with intervals of incandescent lights. We will split into 2 groups, a set to go after the pod, another to stay and repair the ship. Okay, they all said, before moving back into their now dysfunctional cryopods that served as beds. That night, I saw hills of bodies and of blood. That night, I dreamed. We split into 2 parties. I led the party to recover the pod that had been knocked loose during our entry, while Annika stayed behind to man the repair of the Phoenix. With me came Luca and Madison. I had wanted to change Luca for someone else, as his superstition seemed to be rubbing off on me. I was seeing things that weren't there, but Annika needed everyone I could spare. Before we left, we traded in our normal attire for the new improved spacesuits and headed out for the last known location of the pod. If we were lucky, we would recover it not too far from where we crashed and return in one piece. We were not. At intervals during our trek to recover the last pod, I would catch a slight sound of Lucas saying a prayer. I didn't interrupt him, each to his own. Oscar's death weighed deeply on all of us. I was still thinking about our landing when the sound sped past me. Did you hear that? I said as I drew closer to Madison. What? She replied with a confused look as she tried to listen for the sound. She didn't hear anything. I kept it to myself, each to his own. We hadn't found a thing on our first day of searching and had to return to the crash site. Night came and I was the only one awake. Unable to sleep, I pulled out a digital map, overlaid it onto a physical map, and marked out the areas searched. I smelt it when I was about to mark out areas for the next day. This was the first time I smelt it. My first thought was that Billy had farted, but the smell had a burning sensation. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. I put on my suit and moved out of the Phoenix. I was temporarily distracted by the incandescent nature of the night sky. I didn't get lost in it. The noise got louder. I tried but failed to find out where it was coming from, but before the noise could collide with me, and it disappeared. I was just overthinking things. I shook my head and went inside. That night, I dreamt again. The same dream, but this time with a terrifying growl. We moved out the next day. We had to find the pod before it became dark. I got on the comms and tried to radio back our progress. No reply, just pure static that sounded more and more irritating. I almost punched it before remembering the others looking up to me as the beacon of hope. I resolved to try out the radio later the next day. My progress was slow. I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being followed, and it had only worsened since the previous night. My mind flew to Luca. Maybe my psyche was being affected by him. But despite how hard I tried to shake it off, I couldn't stop looking behind to ensure nothing was on our trails. We were moving over a rocky terrain when I heard the noise from my dream. So real was the voice I heard that I tripped and tumbled down the hill. After the fall, I had tried moving, only to shout out in pain. Had I broken my leg? Luca and Madison caught up not long after, and moved to pull him up from the ground when I noticed the mold in the ground. I stepped to the side, or to be more precise, I hopped and bent as I checked it to ascertain what this was. At first, I thought it might have been a rock, but closer inspection revealed it to be a footprint of some sort, and looked nothing like a human's.
"What is it?"
Luca asked. "Nothing," I replied. He didn't need anything to fuel his superstition. We kept walking after Madison helped with my leg. The trek had been slower than when we began. I would have liked to blame it on my leg, but the truth was more than that. Was there life on this planet? The question slipped into my mind, causing me to remember the brief we had gotten from the scientist at NASA. The answer to the question hadn't been certain, but some of them theorized that if there was life, it would probably be nothing but plant life. I repeated it just in my head, even as I forced my legs to move. We hadn't come close to finding the pod on the second day either. We returned to the Phoenix, short of another member. There had been a storm, and Luca had gotten separated during it. We searched for him for days, but the more we searched, the more we came up with nothing. It was almost as if he hadn't even been there in the first place. I called a meeting amongst the remaining crew. It had to be said. There was no need to hide it now.
"William, what is this about?"
Annika asked. "There is something wrong with this planet. I don't know what it is, but we need to get off it now."
"What do you mean, get off it?"
Hayden exclaimed.
"One of us was lost in the storm. We haven't found him yet. We can't just tuck tail and abandon him on this planet."
I tried explaining, or trying to explain, that I didn't think Luca was lost in a storm. He had been taken. I feel like... I stopped to listen to myself. I expected this to come from Luca and not from me. I was still contemplating with my sanity when Billy spoke out.
"You feel like something is watching you at all times, waiting for something before it strikes,"
Billy chipped in. I almost jumped with relief. At least I would have if my leg permitted. Billy continued.
"I noticed it on the second day we landed. There was this hissing sound. I thought I'd developed tinnitus, but I soon began seeing these flashes after the hisses. Eyes." "What are you saying? That something is haunting us?"
Annika asked Billy and me. We were about to reply when she spoke up.
"It doesn't matter. We are going to find Luca before any talk of leaving."
I sat back down and remained silent as they went to bed in preparation for the search the next day. That night I dreamt again. It was troubling now. The dream had come at me so quickly that it forced me to wake up. I woke up in cold sweat and chill, which only got more unnerving when I looked up, only to see it. Immediately I stepped out of bed. I knew it was there. The ship smelt horrible. My eyes watered and burned as they would when exposed to some nerve gas. I put a cloth over my nose. It smelt stale, but stale wasn't the first thing that hit my nose. Putrid was. It was here. My guess was backed up by the chaos that filled the Phoenix. The walls had been ripped up. If I didn't know better, I would have said someone was searching for something. But for what? I mused to myself. "Hello? Annika?" I called, but there was no reply. I called out to Hayden, and there was still no answer. Had they neglected to tell me they were stepping out? What about the rest? Had they gone out to search for the pod on their own because I was slowing them down? They wouldn't have done so, I concluded. I called out to them again. It wasn't until I saw their gloves were still here that I began to worry. They wouldn't have gone out without it. Annika wouldn't have allowed it. Everything was turning. I couldn't breathe, the rhythm of my heart outracing the thoughts in my brain. I pulled myself up and looked out, and that's when he saw it. The ship's floor was covered in a dark fluid. "What is this?" I mouthed as I bent down and touched the ground. My eyes widened in panic, and my sphincter clenched with thoughts of what could happen. I hopped back into Phoenix as I darted from the unseen beast. I moved to the comms and tried radioing them, but there was no reply. Maybe the radio was faulty or something. It wasn't, but maybe it was. I rested my back against the wall, one eye on the ripped-out door of the Phoenix, one on the radio as I adjusted the dials repeatedly and tried again. One trial was rewarded by a click that signified the connection had gone through. This time, I heard a scream from Madison, followed by static. The pain in her voice was maddening. My mind was still running over options when I looked up and saw that the blood had formed a trail. After thinking about my next action, I packed as much gear as I could manage with a bad leg and moved in the direction of my crew. I was only some way out of the Phoenix before it began again. It sounded like a hiss from 100 snakes slithering in my direction. As much as I liked to think it was all in my head, I knew now that this wasn't a dream. Something was on my trail. Something was on this rock of a planet, and it had taken my crew and left me behind. The weather had begun to act up, and I could hear the lightning clash in anticipation of the appointed time. The winds also opined, pushing me back as if to warn me that only death waited for me beyond this point. But I ignored it and continued. I continued no matter how harsh it got. My heart spiked with every step I took, and I felt every strain of the pain bite into me. I ignored both sensations. I had to find them. It didn't matter what it took. I had only walked a few miles when I stopped to rest. I was almost dozing off from the pain and tiredness when the sounds of this thing haunting me began again. Armed with nothing but a flare gun and long rod that was once part of the Phoenix, I took a wide stance, ready to face this thing, this monster. For the first time since my trials began, I heard another sound, a cackle of some sort. It sounded like laughter at my pain and defiance. "Where are you?" I shouted as I gripped my weapons tight as adrenaline passed through me. "Show yourself." There was a scurry of feet, faster than my eyes could follow, but I saw a part of it. The scale of this beast, of this creature, knocked the wind out of me, and I staggered to the floor. What was it waiting for? For me to go completely mad? I wouldn't grant it that. I rested against a big stone and began fiddling with the comms frequency. Something had to go through. I reached a channel that wasn't all static. "William," the voice said as it morphed into part static and part voice. "I can't hear you, Annika. Where are you? Do you have coordinates?" "Help us, William. Help us," Annika said before the channel died. Continuing walking after that was a problem. My mind was filled with doubts. The entire expedition was proof of my failure as a captain. What chance did I stand? My mind kept telling me I had to return to the ship. It was going to be cold soon, and deadly. Turning back, I began to hear the wind. I wouldn't make it back. Getting caught here would mean death. Maybe we deserved it. I mean, who were we to try and leave the planet of our birth? This was going to be the end, I thought to myself. I am ready for death, I muttered under my breath. I am ready to die, I repeated to myself under my breath to steady myself. Maybe if I was more prepared, it would be less painful. It didn't make sense, but it was all I had. The wind had progressed to more than just a whisper. It had transformed into a raging wind. I looked up at it and was about to look away when I saw it in the way. It was a cave. I didn't know it at first, but when the realization hit, I rose to my feet and ran to it. My desperate attempt to beat the wind worked. The cave was standing strong. My goal was to spend the night and resume the next day. The wind had other plans. I stayed there, and I surfaced from the cave when it was over. In the distance I saw a familiar color. It was Luca. I ran up to him and saw... All I will say is that he died in my arms, not before telling me about the monster. The entrance to this cave began at my foot and spanned the length of a small mountain. Images of Luca and the words he had spoken breezed through my mind.
Run. Save yourself.
I shook my head to displace the thought and stop it from taking root. I was going to save them. Nothing was more important now, not even the mission. I felt it again, the chill I felt at the beginning of the mission. Again I shook it and surged into the cave as carefully as possible. The cave floor was filled with an off-white material that gave off a rippling noise, no matter how much care I put into walking on it. The cave being an echo chamber, the noise bounced off the walls into the furthest part of the cave. With the flare gun in my hand, my eyes roamed the cave for any sight of my crew. I did. A trail of blood leading further into the cave was on the floor just in front of me. I took a deep breath, gathered my thoughts, and proceeded further into the cave. There was another opening. Although it was still huge, it stood much smaller than the first one I had entered. The smell lived here, and was even more nauseating now than ever. I walked in and I saw it. Its skin was slimy, and the light shining through the cave reflected off it in a sickly mirror. How had it been able to move so fast? It wasn't important now. I only had 2 bullets, 2 cartridges. I had to make them count. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had to. It was asleep. My eyes traveled the length of the body, and in the middle was the pod we were searching for. That is why the signal kept on moving, I thought to myself. I was about to move to the other side when I heard a whimpering. Whimpering in another cave. I moved to the left, entering the cave, and that was when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Hanging on the cave's ceiling were my crew. Their eyes had been ripped out of their socket. "Who is there?" they chorused. I couldn't catch my breath or stop the tears rushing down my face fast enough to reply to them. I tried to call myself, but before I could, the cave shook. The monster was up. "I am going to get all of you down," I whispered as I moved to a hidden part of the cave. The beast entered the cave. Its skin was slimy, even as it stretched like a serpent. The bulk was just as big as the cave entrances I had entered through. It sniffed me out almost immediately. I fired the first flare and missed. It was only after the flare hit me that I realized I was standing. These were bones, and for the first time I saw its face. Its face was made of eyes. I stood there, all my strength drained out of me. One of the hands grabbed me. I was ready to die. There was no need living anymore. And that was when I heard their voice begging me to help them. I was still weak, but I was strong enough. I picked up the flare gun and fired one shot at its eyes. It dropped me on the floor as it let a screech. Before it could recover, I took the shaft and pierced it into the beast's brain. There was a loud screech, and that was the end of it. At least, I wished it was. I took the pod and went south with it. That's where I am recording this, hoping someone back on Earth will get this. My crew, they begged me to end it. The damage had been too much for them to love through. I am not so sure I want to go back anymore. Not after what I did. Not after hearing the hisses again. I am the last member of the crew member of the Phoenix Ark, and this is my last communication. Hey, sci-fi horror fans. It's Thomas. Thanks for listening. To connect with and support us, make sure to check out our Discord and Patreon links in the description. And remember, stay cosmic.